I was asked if I would say something about sustainable housing research and innovation and so on. And most of the work that we've done in Leeds over the years has been heavily focused around the technology. But we've also taken an interest in the human dimension or the human factors in much of this. So it strikes me that one of the big issues, and very often the elephant in the room in much of the discourse around low energy and low carbon housing, is are the people who live in the dwellings. So it struck me that perhaps this is something that we do need to begin to redress. Dwellings are in fact, in very old ergonomic speak, human machine systems, i.e. we have hardware, in this case dwellings, and that, going the wrong way, and that hardware modifies to some extent the external environment to create an internal physical environment for this lot. And the people who are living there have all sorts of normal living tasks. They have social needs, psychological needs, health needs, and all the rest of it. Very often we have a very narrow view about what those are. Of course, we have mechanisms for controlling the internal environment, and of course a lot of that takes energy and emits CO2. So what we really have here is a very complex purposive system. If you stretch this, as Paul has just described, to the community level, actually your complexity gets even greater, because you have all sorts of social interactions that actually might help, and also might help to define who it is who are living in these dwellings a little bit more, but nevertheless we have a system that's really quite complex, and that tends to create problems that we might think of as wicked. Rittel and Weber in the 1970s, in the context of planning, began to talk about the sorts of problems that are extremely difficult to define. I won't read all this out, but that they have multiple starting points, multiple definitions, multiple solutions that change over time, and it's very, very difficult to say you have reached a perfect solution. I'm sure that even at Lilac, they wouldn't suggest that they have the perfect solution. They have a solution that's good enough for the time being, and then you need mechanisms to change that solution as you grow, as you change, as the children grow and become teenagers and so on. Their needs will shift a little bit. The extent to which the community has to evolve in that is very, very important. That led me, because very often when we design dwellings, low carbon dwellings in particular, we often have a very narrow view about how people are going to live in these so-called low carbon housing, which led to this poem, which I won't read out because I haven't got time, but essentially it's trying to say that designers tend to have a very focused view about who is going to live, and they are going to give this to people, and they would expect people to actually do what they're told. Now, of course, we know that isn't true. So what I want to do is tell you a few stories from a project we did some years ago at Elm Tree Mews. This is Joseph Rowntree. It was their attempt in 2000-2001 to design what they might see as a prototype for 21st century living. In New Earswick, hence the, sorry about the rather stretched picture, but hence the sort of arts and crafts sort of vernacular style of the building. We monitored this, we measured it in all sorts of ways, and some of these stories are about some of the things that the people that we talked about. The first thing is the design team, in good old-fashioned, I suppose, low-carbon design, said what you need is a buffer space, a little sun space, which they called a winter garden, which is a very clever little name. I mean, stuff doesn't actually grow much in the winter, so having a winter garden just suggests to me that you just got bare soil all over the place. But they have this little room called a winter garden, which was not part of the thermal envelope. People didn't really know what it was for, even being told this is your winter garden. As it happens, it didn't get an awful lot of solar either, because of the trees around and so on. And so when we talked to people about it, this was one response: you can't use it, there's no heating, We use it as a bit of a dumping bin, which suggests lack of storage space elsewhere, takes up space, and to be honest, this person was probably, I think, a little bit more keen on getting as much garden space as they could. It would be better if you knocked it down, because we don't really know what to do with it, and it actually doesn't serve a particularly useful function. Another family said, well, actually, we've got a little sort of kilowatt blow heater, and we could probably put that in there to heat it in the winter, and bearing in mind this is not as well insulated as the rest of the envelope, so we can warm it up in there, and we could use it as a dining space. So it makes you wonder what was in the head of the designer in terms of the people that they were designing for. How were they sort of trying to tailor this to their image of people who were actually going to be living in the housing? Other stories hinge around the basic technology, and this is just a very little, I think, interesting example of the way in which you can get carried away with technology. This is a good old-fashioned hot water system, right? Which was a bit complex because the scheme had a heat pump, so we had heat pump heat at very low temperatures compared with what you would normally expect going into a hot water system. 40-45 degrees is not what you would want in your hot water cylinder, because you increase the risk of Legionella. However, there's low temperature hot water heat. There's also solar heat going into it of various temperatures, depending on the solar, depending on the sort of day it is, and also you've got good old-fashioned electric immersion heat going in at high temperature. In fact, we had to install shunt pumps into this because we were beginning to realise that the hot water was not getting up to 60 degrees for Legionella problems, and so we had to actually have a pasteurisation cycle that ran every week, timed using the immersion heater to raise the temperature of the water. So we had technological complexity that was very difficult to control, and even the technologists found it hard to understand quite what the implications of that were. From the point of view of the residents, who in this instance just wanted a nice warm bath, their perceptions and their expectations were really quite interesting, because again, here's the hot water. The resident here, the person who was, the head of the household effectively, said that they were very happy with the hot water because they thought these solar panels were fantastic. Because our data said that the solar panels weren't working properly. The heat was in fact coming all from the immersion heater, but the resident, again, and this is an interesting point about households I'll make in a minute, but the head of the household said, I don't use the immersion heater. But then the kids said, well, we do. Because the kids knew from where they lived before that you can just, you can just turn the immersion heater on and you get nice hot water. Well, that's not surprising, is it? Because it's a good old-fashioned resistant water heater. But this raises all sorts of questions about what do we want, how do we get it, how do we get a clue, and how do we know when things are not working? One of the interesting things here, in fact, was that quite a number of the solar systems were not working effectively. Some of them were partially working and some of them were not working at all. But nobody knew they weren't working. The only people who knew they weren't working was us, because we were measuring them. There were no signals apart from our data that was telling us that they weren't working effectively. In fact, one had a kinked pipe, so there was no flow, but nobody knew there was no flow till we said, hang on a minute, this isn't working, let's have a look at it. There was no flow. Well, that's not surprising, because there was a kink in the pipe. And they said, well, where is it? And we said, well, actually, we've got some photographs and we can probably show you where it is. And we found it. And they had to open up the structure, unkink the pipe or put new bits of pipe in, and it worked a bit better after that. But the point about this is that as far as the users are concerned, their expectations are not really sort of being sort of understood too much. And in this particular instance, this was another resident who said, well, actually, we adapt to our technology effectively because they just get used to working around the fact that it's difficult to control the hot water and get the hot water when you want it. This is another very simple example, just about the very simple idea of how do I set my thermostat. Well, this resident said, I was told by the plumber the best thing to do is to set it at 20. Problem is, where's 20? We actually asked the manufacturer where 20 was, and the manufacturer said, I'm not sure. So we actually had to look at the inside of the thermostat and gradually worked out where 20 was, or how this scale worked. You'll notice there's a scale graphic on here, but that doesn't tell us very much. Now, just imagine what the image is here of the designer thinking, people don't like numbers, so let's give them a little graphic. I'm caricaturing, I know. And probably being a bit unfair. But the point is that this is an instant where numbers are actually very useful, because you can say, set it at 20. And if you don't like 20, set it at 21 or 22 till you find it's okay. But at least you know where you're setting it every time. So in this particular instance, again, we have technology, very simple technology that we're all quite used to, yet it doesn't quite fit how we want to operate. So the question is, why do we get it so wrong? And why do we keep getting it so wrong? And why do people make life so difficult for designers? Well, there are two things. First of all, it actually is complicated. This little story again from Elm Tree Mews. Let's look at this. This is the sort of delivered energy per square metre for the dwellings that we monitored. This one is a single person household, 3, 5, 4. Yet the single person household in a smaller house is using more energy than all the rest of them. These actually are more or less much of a muchness. There is a sort of frugal use of hot water in that particular instance. Well, interestingly, this particular resident thought heat pumps were fantastic and knew that heat pumps were really very efficient, low carbon, coefficients of performance of 3 or 4 typically, as that's the headline. As it happened, Elm Tree Mews' coefficient of performance was probably more like 1.5 or 2, as it happens. But the point is, she wasn't too worried in this instance about the space heating element, but very frugal in use of electricity, turn stuff off, all that sort of thing. Now, the point here is that this space heating element, which was the largest amount of space heating even in total, leaving aside the fact that it was a smaller dwelling, some of that space heating requirement is higher because there's only one person living there, so that the internal gains from people are much lower. Also, the gains that you get when you turn your television on and all the rest of it are also much lower. So if you were to advise this person on what were they going to do and how they were going to get that down, it raises all sorts of difficult questions about quite what is the best thing to do. Is it that you should just turn your heating off a lot more, or should you not do that? I mean, and it's about how comfortable you want to be. So the whole question gets a little bit complicated. This is just the same story, but using the carbon emissions. In fact, because this person was quite relatively frugal in terms of electricity consumption, that's what brought down the overall carbon emissions in this instant. And of course, the problem is that people are people are people. Now, this is William. Now, William's requirements are linked very much to William's parents. And at that stage of life, they have a whole set of needs, different sorts of needs to that which they might have later. And this is William's grandma and great-grandma, and they have quite different requirements as well in the sort of houses that they live in. And this is William's duck. Now, William's duck has very simple requirements. Just needs a box with other toys, needs to be played with from time to time, not too temperature sensitive. Sadly, sometimes what we do is we design as if we're designing for the duck and not for the people who are actually living in the dwelling.
Can we use a duck pond from expenses from the...
Sorry?
Can't we use a duck pond for the expenses from the MPs?
I suppose we could really, yeah. I mean, it only has a toy box, it doesn't have a house. It's just a toy box. Anyway, it's quite sustainable as well, because this was second-hand timber that we used to create the duck. The question here is who are we designing for? And this brings me to this notion. It's not a new notion, but the whole idea of user-centered design. And it raises all sorts of very clear questions about who we're designing for, do we understand our users? Do we understand their needs? Interestingly, do we understand the way users understand? This brings us back to the whole question about controls and other things that you might provide. Do we have the practical design tools? And I suggest very often we don't. Do we have the practical models that we can use to understand how different patterns of use might actually require different sorts of design approaches? Do we understand the different interactions between the different systems, the different sorts of people? And perhaps the most important thing is, do we ever make our assumptions explicit? Very often, designers, and we're all designers to some extent, we actually have, perhaps tacitly, we have a picture of who it is we're designing for. And very often it's for people like us, because we're the only frame of reference we have. But those assumptions are never made explicit. And because those assumptions are not made explicit, how can you measure whether something is working based upon the assumptions that you made? Because you didn't even make the assumptions in the first place. So we have to be clear, a lot clearer, about what we expect in terms of the way these dwellings are going to be used and the implications that may have on... and of course, the duck just doesn't expect too much at all. This led me to looking at the whole concept of personas. Now, personas were something that were derived, or first coined, probably around about the early 90s, largely in the context of software design and other areas of design. And the whole idea of personas is basically trying to pick up archetypical users who embody goals, aspirations, etc. And in this particular instance, here's an example of personas that Vicky Haynes and Val Mitchell at Loughborough applied when trying to understand people's propensity to renovate and to improve their dwellings, in this case, in the case of solid wall housing. And from a lot of interview work, workshop type work with a whole range of different users, or different families really, they developed about 7 personas, which they then used to think about the way in which we might develop different policies for encouraging people or enabling people to improve their dwellings. And this is just an example of the sort of thing that we're talking about. So that leads me to thinking then, by extension, do we ever really try and describe the sort of households we're talking about, what stage of life they're at? Do we have scenarios that enable us to think about how those households might operate within the sort of low carbon design that we're trying to develop? And of course, using those to help us to develop predictive models that will help us to understand a little bit more what the energy outcomes might be, and then we can stop blaming the users. A number of times I've been to conferences and you talk about all the technology, and then somebody usually asks a question and says, but it's usually because the users don't know how to use the house. Well, in my experience, it's because the designers don't understand how the users want to use the house. They use the house because that's the way they want to live, not because you've told them they've got to be low carbon, although that might be another issue. So this really brings me to the end, and God knows what time it is. It seems to me, in terms of building a research base, there's an awful lot we know already about personas and households and energy consumption. There are actually an awful lot of monitored studies going back quite a long way, from which we could actually understand a heck of a lot more than we do. It's something that Bill Bordas refers to as the forgetting function. We're very good at forgetting that we did all this fantastic work in Milton Keynes in the early 1980s. Evidence gathering for personas. Personas only work if they're evidence-based. The problem with personas is that once you get hold of the concept, you could say, right, let's all sit in a room and we'll just imagine people. Well, that's sort of okay, but it doesn't really get us very far. So it's about how do we talk to people, how do we understand how they understand, and so on and so on, so that we can begin to build personas that we can start to work with. That will enable model building, which would be capable of predicting the likely energy and carbon implications of different sorts of design with different sorts of personas, which you can then evaluate. And in fact, maybe it's this evaluation of the feedback and the use of the feedback that's actually going to be quite critical. And it seems to me that one of the Elm Tree Mews residents actually caught most of this in a nutshell when, I think it was a he or a she, can't remember, it's one or the other, it wasn't a duck anyway. I think what they should have done was got a little patch of ground somewhere, built one, tested it, put people in it that were willing to, maybe free, just for the sake of testing it, then get their reaction of how they felt about it, but instead they've moved us all in and everything's going pear-shaped. And it's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, do we really ever actually look at this in quite this way? And I think that's just an interesting observation from a resident from Elm Tree. Thank you.